Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a pleasure to be with you here today on Facebook. This is my first time doing the Facebook Live directly from my phone while on the road. The situation that we have been witnessing the past week in Al-Aqsa Mosque and the attacks on Jerusalem necessitated for me to come and to have a discussion with you, but to contextualize it in a much more in-depth discussion of Palestine, Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa, and the ongoing occupation. What I wanted to do today is, one, is to reshift the discussion and broaden the discussion about Al-Aqsa Mosque for us to understand what is really taking place today and to look at it from a longer history. Also to try to put some really points of what we need to do, both for us abroad in the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and other places, but also as well in the Arab world. I know that people who are joining us are joining from all over the place, from UK, from Palestine, from Jordan, from the US and Canada. And hopefully we're able to put some ideas together of what we need to do. So let me begin first with looking. Today is the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. This is 100 years since the adoption and the issuing of the Balfour Letter this coming November. This is the anniversary of the 1967 war. That we're in the 50th anniversary of the 1967, and also 69 years since the 1948 Nakba, and 10 years for the siege on Gaza. So we're dealing with many different anniversaries dealing with Palestine. The key point in here is that Palestine has been occupied for quite a long time. And the issues that we've been dealing with are not only as a result of today, but rather of a long duration, extending prior to the collapse of the Ottomans and continuing to our present day circumstances, where we find Palestine and its population living a tormented occupation, dispossession, and continued colonization. Now, when we speak of Palestine, often history is related to what the Zionist narrative is about, meaning that the Zionists are returning to claim Palestine. This essentially centers the narrative, Zionist narrative, about the return, and also puts the Palestinian or relegate Palestinians into almost a sideshow or completely outside of history. Palestine has been a land that has been inhabited from the earliest period of human existence. In reality, we find that archaeological discovery from the pre-Stone Age man period extending 65,000 years and continuing all the way up to the development of civilization itself in the area of Palestine, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Egypt. In particular, when we speak about Jerusalem, actually Jerusalem as a city is dated back to the Canaanites of 1800 BC, meaning almost 800 plus years prior to the arrival of the Hebrews into what we call today Palestine. Meaning this notion that we often hear from the Zionists that they were the first to create a state, quote, this is often used in the modern language, that they're the only ones to have created a state, has to be challenged at the basis of it from every archaeological work and research and scholarship on that field. Archaeology actually is very clear on this issue. Whenever we look at archaeology in Palestine, we could ascertain that the Canaanites are the earliest inhabitants, are the ones that have developed what we call early city-states and political structures in there. And the Hebrews, in essence, were invading into Palestine while it was already in establishment. It's actually ironic and unique that both in the Egyptian texts of the pharaonic periods as well as in the Romans writings, we find very little mention of the impact of the Hebrews and their significance in relations to the region. And this is again just to contextualize our history when we speak that this is the land of the Canaanites, and again we assert as Palestinians as well as Arabs from the larger region that we are essentially some of the descendants of the Canaanites, even though that establishing absolute link with purity of connection is very difficult for any human group, but essentially the Canaanites are recognized as being the earliest inhabitants of this region. And then into Palestine comes in a variety of different people throughout the history, from the Egyptians to the Persians to the Hebrews to the Romans and so on. So it's, in essence, we think when we look at history in relations to Palestine, we have to have a very expansionist and a very wide scope of history and not accept the Zionist narrative that attempts to locate the history in an exclusivist, very narrow history, and in essence to authenticate their claim of a return back to claim the territory. If anything, Zionism is a modern phenomenon that attempted to create its particular type of notions as a way to escape from European anti-Semitism by creating a distinctive nationalist project in order to create a people, and thus the people and a land is to be matched in order to create a particular modern phenomena in this sense. So this is an important grounding in relations to the history of Palestine, the Palestinians, as well as the earliest inhabitants in Palestine. Now, when we speak about the modern 20th century, modern 20th century of Palestine have experienced the British colonial designs over Palestine, and as such we have to understand that Palestine was not occupied only in 1947. The real beginning of Palestine, of the occupation of Palestine, began either November 9th or 11th, depending on the historical surrender of Jerusalem to the British Army in 1917 at the end or toward the conclusion of the First World War. So the British occupation of Palestine of November 9th or November 11th of 1917 is the beginning of the occupation of Palestine. Now, just on a side note, the Balfour Declaration was issued on November 2nd, 1917, which means that the British promised a property that they themselves had no possession of at the time of the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. I know sometimes legal issues might be a little bit complicated, but at the foundation of legal discourse and legal foundation is that you have to have possession before you actually are able to dispossess of that which you actually have control of. So the British issued the Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, which means that they issued it at the time where they had no control of Palestine. It was a correspondent to the World Zionist Organization. Actually, it was a personal letter to Lord Rothschild at the time, who was not in Palestine, nor was a citizen of Palestine at the time, so promising a property or a territory that they did not possess to a private group, in that sense the World Zionist Organization that was in Europe, a European enterprise at the time, and as such, while dispossessing of the Palestinians, the indigenous population, which constituted the overwhelming majority of the population at the time. So this is just in terms of contextualizing and making sure that when we speak of the occupation of Palestine, we have to say that the Balfour Declaration of 1917 issued at the time of November 2nd began the occupation, the modern occupation of Palestine of the British, and then the British from 1917 onward began the process of dispossessing the Palestinians in order to set up at the time, a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was incorporated into the League of Nations, and the League of Nations gave it the international legitimacy in order to make sure that the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine is to take shape. So this gets us into the machination, the mechanism by which that Palestine was transformed into a tool for a colonial enterprise. Now, the second correction that I wanted to make, that we often have begun to speak of Palestine's occupation, dispossessions, and so on. And what we need to speak is that Palestine is the last colonial project to be commissioned by Western forces, or by Western powers, in particular Great Britain. And I always say that Great Britain is no longer great, and it is shrinking with the Brexit right now. We're seeing the consequences. But to specifically say that it was the last colonial project to be commissioned in order to actually absolve Europe of its own endemic anti-Semitism. In essence, many of those who actually developed the Balfour Declaration were themselves anti-Semite, no more than Balfour himself was a vehement anti-Semite. And in essence, because of the Jewish migration from Eastern Europe into parts of Western Europe, including London and other places, that there was a need, again, in European history, is to transfer the Jews out of Europe, having this notion of what's called the Jewish question. And I always challenge this concept of the Jewish question in the same way that today we have the so-called Muslim question in Europe. These Jewish question, Muslim question, these are racist framing of the European question, or the European problem of racism, of not wanting and not being able to actually live with the other. Going back again to 1492 and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Europe, and the long history and the long durée from 1492 all the way up to the 20th century, what we see is Europe's incapacity and incapability to actually live and incorporate the constructed other into what we know or what we understand Europe to be. So the expulsion, the Inquisition that occurred in 1492 and the expulsion in 1609 is the paradigmatic part of European history, is the norm rather than the exception. So the Balfour Declaration and the need to transfer the Jews out of Europe was what was framed as the Jewish question, which essentially has to be thought of as the European question, which is the racism and the structural racism that has been part and parcel of European history in general. Now, what is unique in here is that the World Zionist Organization at the time accepted and adopted this notion of solving the Jewish question in Europe by accepting to the transfer out and accepting to be a junior partner in the colonial enterprise. So Palestine becomes the last colonial project, and we could say the last settler colonial project to be commissioned in the 20th century. The British facilitated this, and other European powers facilitated this, and then post-Second World War, the United States inherited and continued to work to the fulfillment of the settler colonial project. This is an important issue because we often try to appeal to European sentiments, to European human rights, to say that they need to uphold the highest principles of their own civilization, that they need to adhere to standards of human rights, to adhere to the Fourth Geneva Convention. And in here there's an element of contradiction because Europe sees in the adoption of the Zionist project a success on the one hand of its own project of trying to absolve itself of the historical wrongs that continue to be committed all the way from pre-1492 all the way to the present, but more importantly in post-Second World War as a way to absolve itself of what they have done to the Jews in Europe. It sees this as a fulfillment of part of their remorse. But I think there is a subtext to this. In essence, there is an aspect of European discourse in relations to Palestine, this irredentism that Palestine belongs to Europe, and in its belonging to Europe, in essence, they see an aspect of trying to establish a foothold of civilization in Palestine. And many of those who were speaking of the Jewish national homeland, as well as the Zionists themselves, spoke of this project as being a foothold of civilization to civilize the Muslim world and to bring forth a transformation in the region. So we have to make that connection very clear. So when we speak of European or calling upon European human rights values, or the United States, or even in the international community, there's often a double-edged sword in here, that on the one hand, there are higher ideals and values that are contained in the human rights discourses, but simultaneously, in essence, they have to admit that what they have achieved and what they have adopted in relations to the Zionist project in Palestine was an utter complete failure for them to depart from continuing to extend the unquestionable support that we see them sending to Israel on a regular basis. So that gets us into that Palestine is a settler colonial project, the last settler colonial project to be commissioned in the 20th century. Now, a settler colonial project is distinctive from regular settler colonies, or is distinct from colonies in general. Great Britain had colonies, and Britain was the mother land. Similarly, France had colonies, and France was motherland and benefited from the labor, natural resources, the markets of the colonies. Settler colonial projects don't have a need for the indigenous population. Most often, indigenous population in settler colonial projects are put to genocide. And I think if for those in the Americas, or in Australia, and other places where you had indigenous populations, those populations, when the settler colonial project emerges, there is genocide. And if genocide is not completely successful or has not been completed, then you have the second part, which is transferring an indigenous population to empty the land for the settler colonial project or communities that are coming. Palestine is facing a settler colonial project, which is similar to what we find in the Americas, similar to what we find in Australia, similar to what South Africans have faced until the end of apartheid. And I think in here one has to understand that both the transfer was an important aspect of the apartheid regime and the creation of what's called homelands for the black populations. It's actually one of those areas that Ariel Sharon was enamored with, the South African model. And I would say that in the West Bank, in terms of the divisions and the different regions that have been set up in the West Bank, are somewhat resembling the black homelands that were set up in South Africa, and they were given what's called autonomy or right to rule, and called independent black states. They were not recognized by anybody other than South Africa at a time. But it's interesting to see that the same strategy right now possibly can be applied in relations to what we see in the West Bank, with the Palestinian Authority given responsibility or control over parts of the West Bank. Between Area A and Area B is about 39%, where 61% or 62% are subject to Israeli control. So the transfer policy is part and parcel of settler colonial project as well as genocide. 1947-48, where you had Resolution 181, that gets us into the implementation of the transfer policy to the Palestinians. And this transfer policy essentially was by force, by means of expulsion, by means of massacres. Over 100 massacres that have been documented through a variety of different authors and literatures, whether you read Jewish sources with the new historians as well as Palestinian historians from Birzeit that are working on documenting the various massacres that Palestinians were forced to flee from their homes, forced to flee from their land, and acts of genocides, in essence, because it's complete erasure of Palestinians that took place in 1947-48 in order to create modern Israel. And on top of the expelled Palestinian lands, homes, cities, towns, the modern state of Israel was created. So in essence, the modern state of Israel as a state benefited from acts of genocide and acts of mass expulsion that took place. And if you look at the definition of genocide in the United Nations Convention, you will find that what happened to the Palestinians and continued to happen to the Palestinians actually fits the exact definition of genocide. Now, why do I speak in Al-Aqsa today, beginning with 1948 and settler colonialism? Many of us would have to understand that the Nakba has not ended. The Nakba continues till today. The Nakba is a process of continuing to transfer the Palestinians in order to take maximum land with minimum number of Palestinians on those lands. Meaning it's a systematic process of dispossessing the Palestinians of their land, removing them from their land, removing them from their properties, from their territories, and creating impediments in their face in order to achieve the project of Greater Israel. And again, if we speak about the Greater Israel from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, it's in effect, you have total Israeli control from the Jordan River all the way to the Mediterranean, dispensing with the Palestinian cantons or Pantustans that are right now in the West Bank, that are governed within a process that secures Israel, secures settlements, secures the settlers at the expense of the Palestinian population. So when we speak about Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque, we're speaking of Resolution 181. You cannot actually speak of Al-Aqsa and speak of Jerusalem without actually going back to Resolution 181. Resolution 181 created Jerusalem as a separate territory to be governed by an international order or an international regime. Meaning that Resolution 181 set the framework that we are today are inheritors of this aspect of the structure that was placed by, again, the international community. Now, the international community has to be understood. It acted and participated in the structural dispossession of the Palestinians. So when we go and meet with the British or the French or the Americans or any of the so-called representative of the international community, they were participants, structural participants in the dispossession of the Palestinians. And I think the day will come when we have to take our case not only to the United Nations, which is increasingly is only a rubber stamp for the United States policy, but we need to take the challenge to every country that have aided and abetted in the dispossession of the Palestinians, whether these were institutions of civil society, parliaments, governments that have made it possible not only to support Israeli dispossessions of the Zionist dispossession of the Palestinians, but continue to send armaments, troops, training of the troops, send all types of support, economic support, facilitate the selling of Israeli settlement products into their markets, completely targeting Palestinians in exile constantly to frustrate their ability to make their case, as we see today in the pursuit and in attempt to try to silence those who are advocating for BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction. So when we speak about Al-Aqsa today, it has to be seen as a process that begins with the issuing the Balfour Declaration, continued with the Nakba in 1948 with Resolution 181, and continues up to the present day. Now, I want to shift a little bit to specifically speaks about what is taking place in the West Bank and what is taking place in Jerusalem and what is taking place in Al-Aqsa today. Now, since the Israel occupation, which should not be disconnected of settler colonial project, but speaking of the occupation of 1967, Israel have immediately moved to try to annex Jerusalem and declare it to be its capital. In 1967, again, Israel incorporated what is called East Jerusalem, which was the Arab population, the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem, and began to systematically tighten the structure around them in order for claiming the city to be the capital of Israel. The official annexation doesn't come about until 1980 with the Knesset issuing the Israel Basic Law that basically annexed Jerusalem and declared it to be the capital of Israel. Now, for sure, this annexation is not recognized by anyone. Actually, the international community in this sense have to be given credit, despite what we're seeing in terms of attempt to escape taking responsibility. The international community still till today does not recognize Israel's annexation of Jerusalem, Israel's annexation of the territories that were gained by the 1967 war, because it goes and contradicts the basic premises of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from acquiring and taking properties that were acquired as a result of conflict and annex it into its territory. So the fact that the international community is still, till today, hold that the Jerusalem is an occupied territory, which means any alteration to the status quo that exists in Jerusalem, it goes to contravene the basic contours of international law. Now, I understand that international law today does not have the enforcement mechanism. And more so, it does not have the enforcement mechanism because the major powers, in here the United States, one also could add Russia, Great Britain, and also France, have historically acted to protect Israel and prevent the international mechanisms that are present from bringing enforceability into the various resolutions and various aspects of international law. So in this sense, the enforceability of these have been curtailed, especially by the United States, which have cast more vetoes in protecting Israel at every juncture than anything else. So what we see again in here is the fact that international law is on the side of the Palestinians in relations to Jerusalem, is on the side of Palestinians also in relations to Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is a Muslim property. It is to be managed by the Waqf. And even if you go back to the early 1931, which the British had the what they call at the time the Wailing Wall Commission. The Wailing Wall Commission actually came out with the determination that the wall, as well as that pathway that was there, is a Muslim Waqf property, and the Muslim Waqf property that actually permitted Jews to pray in that location. And it was actually at the time some right-wingers that wanted to alter the relationship that was in existence in relations to the wall. And what we find is that the British Commission that was sent actually made the determination that this was an actual a Waqf property in that. After 1967, when Israel occupied Jerusalem, that courtyard that we see in front of the wall, that all was actually Waqf properties that were demolished in order to create that courtyard that we see today in pictures when you take pictures of the Wailing Wall, which actually for Islamic tradition it is Ha'it al-Buraq. Again, in here is speaking about the sanctity of Jerusalem and historical site that's been designated by the UNESCO, it is actually to see that the changing and alteration of the status of Jerusalem has been one of the major projects that's been undertaken by successive Israeli governments that are beholden to an extreme articulation, extreme interpretation of an aspect of Zionist conceptualization of rebuilding the Third Temple. And in here, I think the Temple Institute that has been active in attempting to try to create and alter the status of the Al-Haram al-Sharif and the Al-Aqsa Mosque has to be noted, with the support and aiding and abetting of successive Israeli government. So now, when we speak about Jerusalem, it's right now been annexed to Israel in contravention of international law, and as part of reducing Palestinian presence in the city, a variety of initiatives have been taken. One is the revoking residency of Palestinians from Jerusalem. So, for example, a resident of Jerusalem, a Palestinian resident of Jerusalem who travels abroad to study or to work, they are actually required to come back annually to renew their residency. Otherwise, they would lose their residency rights. Now, that same requirement is actually not required for Jewish residents of Jerusalem, which means that there is an effective apartheid structure, meaning that there are two separate sets of laws that are applied to two sets of people depending on their background. So on the one hand, a Palestinian Muslim or Christian have a different set of requirements if he or she travels to work abroad versus their possibly 2 or 3 streets down Jewish neighbor who might go abroad to study or work. They don't have that same requirement. A second part is that also in terms of regulating bringing your husband or wife to live with you. So if a Jerusalemite person marries somebody from the West Bank, which literally would be about maybe 2 miles or even less in some areas, they are unable by law to bring their husband or wife to live with them. And therefore, essentially what we say is that Israel, in essence, have a requirement that it's actually anti-people getting married and living with one another when it comes to the Palestinians. So in this sense, what Israel wants to depopulate Jerusalem, and also to stand in front of the world community, say we don't do anything, we're just trying to essentially ask and get the Palestinians to live with the husband and wife they choose, but they cannot actually bring them to Jerusalem. This again is a basic violation and is a structure of apartheid that relegate different rules and laws pertaining to Palestinian Jerusalemite versus someone that is of a Jewish background. So that's another aspect in there. A third element in here is the continued isolation of Palestinians in Jerusalem from the broader West Bank. And this has been a process, again, that developed during the post-Oslo, but also continued to the present day. The whole structure of the checkpoints that increase and decrease depending on the period, but at any given day, there's about 540 different checkpoints in the West Bank that is intended to strangle the Palestinians of the West Bank from actually having relations and continue to have Jerusalem as the hub of their identity and a hub of their social, political, economic, as well as religious engagement. This actually gets to separate Jerusalem from the broader Palestinian society and the broader West Bank in general. This gets us to understand why, as a response to this, Palestinians from the 1948 have been actually diligently partaking in attempting to visit and increase their presence in Al-Aqsa Mosque as a way to compensate not only for the isolation from the West Bank, but also the financial impact that is being implemented or attempted to be enforced on the Jerusalem population in such a way that they will be strangled financially, economically, by keeping away the vibrancy of Jerusalem as an economic hub for the Palestinians in the West Bank. So that's also another aspect and another layer in there. Fourth is this prevention and prohibition that is there for Palestinians in Jerusalem from actually building and expanding their building to accommodate for natural growth. Palestinians in Jerusalem are unable to get permits, building permits, to expand their building or to actually build for their natural growth. This is at a time where not only that Jewish settlers are given unlimited continued expansion of settlements, but also settlers are allowed, and if anything protected, by allowing them to actually attack and squat on Palestinian properties in Jerusalem, especially in Wadi Silwan and other neighborhoods. So what you have is, on the one hand, strangling Palestinians in Jerusalem from building and expanding naturally to accommodate their natural growth, while on the other hand giving almost unlimited access to settlers to expand, as well as steal outright Palestinian property. Just yesterday you had a number of Zionist settlers in Al-Khalil, for those who don't know, Hebron, Al-Khalil, who actually took over a Palestinian building. And in most civilized countries, when squatters and thugs come knocking on your door to take over your property, you call 911 or you call the police comes and actually takes those who attacked your home out. Not in Palestine, not in Al-Khalil, not in Jerusalem, not in the West Bank. In essence, the police in here, usually it's the Israeli military, the Israeli Defense Force, and I don't know what they're defending, but the Israeli Defense Force comes, sets camp, protects the settlers, and refers the matter to the court. Now, when the Palestinian goes to the court, as expected, the court itself does not give recognition to Palestinian land deeds because of the 1970-72 determination by the Israeli Attorney General that the totality of the West Bank is the disputed territory. And therefore, your claim as a Palestinian coming to court is equal to a claim of a settler who comes and took over your home and land, and therefore it often ends up that in many, many years of the court, and the most prevailing aspect is that the court never rules or rarely rules in favor of the Palestinians, and Palestinians end up being on the street while those who stole his property or her property are there. Often also sometimes you find the settlers produce bogus paperwork, and this bogus paperwork is actually introduced and the court gives it recognition because the court itself is often made up of settlers themselves because it's a military court or a court that is actually beholden to the settlement community in the occupied territory. So what we have here is a sophisticated civil society, settler, colonial structure that is present in there. So when we, speaking of Jerusalem, speaking of Al-Aqsa Mosque, now one has to think that underneath Al-Aqsa Mosque, it's already 6 floors deep. There's a whole structure of excavation that has been undertaken with all types of religious centers that had been set up that are beginning to undermine the structural integrity of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock itself. There is a tunnel that crosses across from one side of the property all the way to the other, and as such there's an undermining that is taking place. Now I know that within the extreme right-wing Zionist settler community, there is a committed group that is wanting to rebuild the temple by destroying Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is not my statement, but the statements of many of these who belong to this Temple Mount or Temple Institute, and they are beholden and attempting to try to really push the world into Armageddon. And I know in here there's literature in the Muslim tradition, the Christian tradition, the Judaic tradition, and other traditions on all types of scenarios for Armageddon. This is not the realm of us as a human being to be forcing the hands of God in any way or possible. And anyway, anything related to narratives of end of times and so on, these are issues that theologians have to be discussed. It is not the realm of those who attempt to try to win a PR campaign and a public relations campaign and try to actually be God themselves in acting out and wanting to bring forth what they conceive or, irrationally conceive to be what they are doing is bringing forth end of time scenarios. And in knowing the United States, we have a large core of extreme religious rights that also wants to bang the drums of Armageddon, and they think that they could win an end of war, an end of the world scenarios, and they see that the confrontation between Muslims and Jews will only hasten the return of Jesus and return of the Messiah. All this narrative begins to be thinking that we are taking ourselves, meaning those who are advocating for this, they're acting as God in order for them to bring something of their own making. If there is rational aspects to it, is there irrational in terms of how they pursue these elements and how they contextualize their notions. What we say today again and again, that it is of no one compulsion nor of anyone's worldview to actually bring about anything relative to this end of time scenario. This is not the realm of what we need to be discussing. We need to challenge everything that is occurring. We need to challenge the dispossession. We need to challenge the settler colonialism. We need to challenge human beings that are not pursuing or putting forth the best of what human beings need to be putting at this particular time. And as such, this right-wing group that today has many Knesset members that are advocating the same type of scenario because they have already married an ultra-nationalist perspective into control and domination of the land. And therefore, the Haram al-Sharif and the Al-Aqsa Mosque becomes an aspect of trying to authenticate their particularly constructed or narrowly constructed ultra-nationalist paradigm. And as such, you could say that modern Zionism in the 20th century wanted to give birth to a new form of a, quote, a Jewish person by having a matrimony between the person and the land in order to bring forth this new powerful person. Again, this is a distorted understanding. It's not an understanding of the text. It's not understanding of the historical relationship between the individual and the sacred. In essence, it's the complete opposite, putting the paradigm upside down in relations to understanding the sacredness and how to approach the sacred in general. So, the current approach that is antagonizing the population, the Palestinian population in Jerusalem, and trying to push forth changing the status quo in Jerusalem, has a political ramification. And it's not surprising that the Israeli government today finds itself to be almost victorious on many levels. One, it has a president in the White House that basically can rubber stamp anything. It has a Congress and Senate that does not have really the courage to challenge and to push forth a different policy. We have many leaders in many parts of the world likewise that are not taking Israel to task. And more importantly, also the Arab and Muslim world themselves are preoccupied. One, they're preoccupied with their own seats of power that has no power other than even the seat itself. They also are really pursuing their own divisions on a daily basis without any outcome for their own population. And adding insult to injury, we are the region that has bought the most weapons in the past 15 years to actually completely wipe out another 1 or 2 generations of the Arab and Muslim world. Just if you think from the 1979 period until now, if you add up on a conservative level, almost 5 million to 8 million Arab Muslims have completely been wiped out through all types of conflicts and war, and it doesn't seem to be that there is any end in sight. And in this sense, Israel becomes an important ally, and it's not surprising that some countries think of Israel as an ally to suppress their own domestic population, but also to speak of another boogeyman that is present today. So every other day we have a new boogeyman that we need Israel and Western countries to try to help end or save us from this boogeyman. And the way they save us is by buying more weapons, selling more oil, buying more weapons, selling more oil, and ending up again ransoming and subverting our own future, our own vision, our own societies for the foreseeable future in order to maintain jobs and economies somewhere else. So Israel sees itself at this point as the hegemon of the region, that there is no one to contest its power. There is nobody in the Arab and Muslim world that could actually raise a voice. Possibly there is exception. One could mention a number of countries, but that's not the importance of which countries are there. But in general, Israel is the hegemonic power in the region, uncontested, and has complete freedom of operation across many parts of the world, and as many parts of the region. And as such, we could see as Palestinians, we are in a very difficult position, both internally because we are divided, but also regionally we have no base of support at this particular time to speak of, with some limited exception. And then the strategic landscape in the Arab and Muslim world is preoccupied with a number of wars that have completely depleted our abilities to alter and change the current context that we find ourselves. So this really gets us into the Israeli government, as well as its settler community, which is right now almost 600,000 strong, that has had a stronghold on the government, is not in any position to alter its course, because there is no counter force to actually push it away from this direction that is pursuing, whether it's inside the occupied territories, in the regional Arab and Muslim frame, or in the international community. I think the structure that is there leaves Israel in total control of all options at the table. And thus, you could see that the Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank are responding. They're saying that we have no one to depend on at this particular time, and many people have forgot us, in essence, forgot our circumstances. And I would say that, considering the landscape both domestically and internationally, Palestine has become on the back burner, and the circumstances that are facing them are really at this point very daunting, to say the least. And again, this is in looking at the larger landscape. Now, what can we do? And this is the part that I would like for us to think about. And I think there is still things that we need to undertake in many different places. One, I think many of us are aware that this Friday and Saturday in many places across the world, in Europe, the United States, Canada, and other places, as well as in the Muslim world, there are mobilizations to support and defend Al-Aqsa Mosque, and to defend the rights of freedom of religion, freedom of access to all religious places. Now, let's just be straight. this is a Muslim property. End of the story. This is a mosque that has been in place for at least the last 1420 years, if we just take any measure. Just have the decency to respect that this is a property belongs to someone else. If you have your imagination about something that you want to have your own religious attachment, have your religious attachment, but have it at your own home to begin with. And therefore, you have to respect the right of the Palestinians to their religious site. And this is part of religious freedom for people to have their religious rights. It's only ultra-nationalists that wants to see a demolition of existing religious site of another people in order for them to actualize their own self-deluded notion of what it is mean to be in the modern contemporary period. So I think what we need is to assert that this has to be a respect and an affirmation of the internationally recognized property possession of the Palestinians to the sacred site, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and its precinct. And settlers and Temple Institute and Knesset members who are speaking about destroying Al-Aqsa Mosque, about building a temple in there, about having to come in there on a daily basis, wanting to share the property. This has to be completely opposed outright. We already saw the circumstances that have governed what took place in Al-Khalil, and we know exactly what happened in the Al-Ibrahimi Mosque in Al-Khalil in Hebron. And as such, this is, again, we're saying that this cannot be the case of allowing this type of behavior to continue and pursue. Now, again, what we need is to take steps to participate this Friday and Saturday in wherever you are in the mobilizations that are taking place in a peaceful way, because the power of the people will at the end make a difference in what is occurring. So I'll encourage you to participate on the Friday and Saturday of this week. Second, I think for many of us that are engaged in work with civil society, I think what we need is to begin to build stronger local coalitions for us to have official statements that are coming from our coalition partners on religious freedom, respecting Palestinian religious rights, and recognizing indigenous Palestinian rights in Palestine. And this is very important because civil society is where the battle for public opinion needs to be undertaken. And I think similarly in the Arab and Muslim world, it is time for us to actually take on the step of making our civil society voices loud, to make our civil society actions very symbolically recognizable. And I know that the repression that is taking place, the silencing that is taking place in many places in the Arab and Muslim world, it's very daunting. But I am very confident that we will be able to overcome many of those restrictions, many of those walls that have been built. It's not only Israel that is building walls inside Palestine, but in the Arab and Muslim world, walls of fear are being built in order to silence individuals from actually speaking and speaking truth to power, in order for them to have a meaningful part in shaping their own society and having a vision for the future. So again, I would encourage for us to partake in making this one aspect of our engagement. Third, I would say that what Palestinians need today inside Palestine is a joint effort from across the world of sending fact-finding missions from civil society organizations, from human rights organizations, from parliamentary committees in various parts of the world. I think I was comforted to see some of the protests in Ireland, the support that they expressed. I saw some of the mobilization that took place in Chile. I saw some of the mobilization that took place in the UK. And I think wherever we have presence of support in civil society, in parliamentary delegations, is for us to encourage those to actually send fact-finding mission with the direct responsibility of actually issuing reports that will come out and a whole activity take place around them. And I also saw some of in the Arab world, parliamentarians in the Arab world have actually gathered and engaged. I saw the gathering in Tunisia parliament where all political parties have stood in support. I saw the statements that came out from Turkey, from Qatar, from Kuwait, from members in various Algerian associations, in Morocco, Mauritania, Sudan. So all these, I think what we need is to actualize our collective power in order to make these fact-finding missions, fact-finding organizations as part of the transformation that is needed in order to make an impact. Just need to know that silence does not lead to change. It's only effective work and speaking in a sustained manner can bring change, and I am very confident that change is possible for Palestine and other people, other regions as well. Now, the fourth element that I want people to actually engage in, we have to have an intense commitment and intensify our commitment to the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction. It is not surprising that the Israeli government, the Hasbara network, the various political machinations around the world are attempting to silence the BDS movement. This is the call from the Palestinian civil society in order to bring about change, peaceful change, by actually engaging in boycott, divestment, and sanction. It is the same type of movement that the South African have undertaken in order to bring about a change and end to the apartheid regime. And I would say that the South African activists have done tremendous job and a tremendous help for the Palestinian cause by doing the research, by doing a lot of work, heavy lifting to actually help in the PDS movement, both in South Africa but other places. And I'm getting very confident that in parts of Europe, the PDS movement has been registering victories. And I think in the United States, the time will come where PDS will be recognized as an important part of shifting the debate and shifting the public sentiments in relations to Palestine. So as we move forward, rather than reduce our commitment and engagement, we have to double our commitment to the PDS movement. And I think on college campuses across US, in Canada, in Europe, and other places, as well as in the Muslim world, because there are many parts of the Muslim world where Israeli products are coming in, using all types of what you call secondary markets to enter. And I think we need to challenge those. There need to be boycott, divestment, and sanctions in the Muslim majority countries. And they need to have an effective strategy of how to pursue it and make sure that normalization cannot take place while occupation, dispossession is still ongoing on a regular basis. And I think that should be one of the major challenges. Now, on the second part, I would encourage our legal scholars in the Arab and Muslim world to pursue ways to file lawsuits against Israeli companies that operate within the settlements and send products to Arab and Muslim markets. I think this would be one of those areas where we can actually explore some of those mechanisms that have been used against the Palestinian political work and political activists in many parts of the world. And I think what we need is to pursue it. Wherever there is a company that is benefiting from the dispossession of the Palestinians, that benefiting whether in 1948 or 1967, or benefiting as a result of the settlements today, that those companies have to be pursued. And I think the Arab and Muslim world, legal minds, should find ways to engage. And I know sometimes our own governments in the Arab and Muslim world are acting themselves to try to prevent civil society from making the effective approaches in order to challenge what is taking place inside Palestine. And I think this is where the PDS movement have to have multiple strategies and multiple approaches in order to do so. Now, the next two items have to do with public officials. And I know that a number of groups have made call for actions to the public officials. I know from the work that we do in the United States that we had made calls to call your representative in order to make an impact. And I think in here, it's definitely an uphill battle in the United States. It's an uphill battle in some countries in Western Europe. But the fact that it is an uphill battle should not preclude us from thinking that this is something that needs to be done, and must be done in order to engage the public officials and representatives. At the end of the day, there has to be a political decision made by decision makers on the protection and the protection of the Palestinians and taking into account of Israel human rights violation, which interestingly enough, the US State Department human rights report recently have taken Israel to task on a number of these issues. So the legal texts are there, but it requires for us to actually mobilize and engage our public officials in a sustained and systematic process, and I think this has to be committed for the long haul. Lastly, I'd encourage all of us to continue to write, to continue to engage in public forums to effect change. So writing is an important outlet. Making documentaries and videos are very important. I was very heartened by the AJ Plus. They had done Al Jazeera Plus, which had a number of pieces that focus on Al-Aqsa Mosque. These are important. They had a number of pieces on the occupation. Also, I would speak of Palestine Remix, which is also has come out in Al Jazeera. Very, very profound work that has been done that brought a very important tools for those who are engaging in organizing and speaking on behalf of Palestine and exposing the continued dispossession that the Palestinians are experiencing. So I am, while today is definitely a very difficult day for the Palestinians, we find ourselves divided politically, we find ourselves completely in almost disarray. Our Arab and Muslim backing is completely faltering. We find regional conflicts have completely derailed and sidestepped Palestine. Now it's no longer the primary and the central cause for the region. All these can get us to understand that we are in a difficult position, but at the same time, Palestine is the international cause that it is, because it represents at the core of it a representation of what people feel in their own self, of what has been done wrong to the Palestinians. It represents what they feel is being wrong in their own countries or their own cities or in their own towns. So there is a Palestine that is present in every part of the world. Just like people went out in Tahrir Square in Egypt, they had the Palestinian flag. They are committed to Palestine because they recognize their own powerlessness that they felt in their own country was representative of what the Palestinians have been facing for 70 years. In a similar way, what we see that in terms of what people were acting and engaging across the world in mobilization with the Occupy movement, as they have been feeling the shrinking of their economic well-being, of their being taken to the cleaners by the 1% and having a sense of poverty. There is a sense that Palestine has played a major role in being that symbolic representation of their dispossession. So in this sense, I'm confident and I'm optimistic that at the end of the day, I believe that Palestine will be free, and I believe that we will all return to Palestine to celebrate and be one with in a property and a territory and a land that will encompass and will be welcoming to everyone. This last thing is very important. We Palestinians are not opposing Zionism on the basis of that because it is a conflict between Jews and Muslims. We are against Zionism because of colonization, settler colonization, and dispossession. And anyone that attempts to besmirch the names of Palestinians and to speak ill of them on the basis of anti-Semitism has to be challenged on this basis. We are a people that have been facing settler colonialism, and it is ironic that Zionism have chosen to be a junior partner for the settler colonial project and for Western colonization in Palestine, while forgetting the historical relationship that existed between Muslims and Jews throughout history. And I think in here that has to be the challenge for us to reconceptualize in a decolonial Palestine and a decolonial world, a reconstituting of a different world, where the world that we are basing ourselves on is not based on the conceptualization of how demarcation been constructed in the 20th century to actually solve, again, going back to European question of the Europe's inability to live with the other. And I think that is the challenge for people who actually have a much deeper recognition and understanding to see what is the modern world other than an attempt to try to verify this constant attempt to try to replicate the incapacity to live with the other. Muslim history, I would say, stands the test of time, and also Arab history stands the test of time of that future possibility of a free Palestine. And I believe that that is within our reach, and I believe that we will be living and we will be seeing a free Palestine. So, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining me. I know many of you possibly have some questions, so I'm going to go on to look at some of the questions. It's already way past the time. It's already about 1:06. So I'm going to see if I'm able to read some of those questions from in here. And if not, then I'll try to respond to some of those questions possibly later on. So thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll see all of you in the work for Palestine. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.